Thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the Kansas Historical Society. How is everybody this evening? Staying warm a little bit, maybe, hopefully? I hope so. This is your 30-second commercial. My name is Vicki Henley. I'm with the Kansas Historical Foundation. That's the part of the society that's like an endowment association, a foundation for a university. We do all the retail, the membership, and the fundraising and fund management. For your membership, there's a membership card here. How many people are members? Oh, good. Good. You get a quarterly historical journal, and you get our brand new piece, which is our Kansas Stories. It just mailed in late September, and we already had a request for 20 copies of it, so it's really going over very well. And so we encourage those of you who are not members to be members, because we couldn't bring you these museum after hours without private funds. So that's the rest of my commercial, and Mary Madden, whose brainchild this is, will talk to you next.
Thanks, Vicki. The editor of Kansas Journal is here, Virgil. I'm going to embarrass you. Virgil! It's been too long. I haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, so it's a wonderful journal. I highly recommend that you get it and read it. My name is Mary Madden. I'm the director of the museum, and tonight I'll put it closer. We don't have a lot of announcements. I do want to say that our annual meeting for the Kansas Historical Society is November 1st. So if you're a member, please come. If you're not a member, please join. And after that meeting, which will last from about 10 to 2, we will be opening our special exhibit, Martha Makes History. So it's a small exhibit, but it's a really cool exhibit about a woman who is an everyday revolutionary. Martha Farnsworth lived in Kansas, and between canning and washing and ironing, she was a suffragette. And her diary, which she kept for 40 years, can you believe that? That's a long time. We have her diary, and she writes about all her campaigning and her work to get women the right to vote, which in Kansas, universal suffrage was 1912. 8 years before national. So this is an exhibit that our senior archivist in the library put together. She's been tweeting. I'm sure you all follow Twitter. I don't either. But she's been tweeting about it. The governor is following her. And so that exhibit, you're invited to the opening from 3 to 6 on Friday, November 1st. To sweeten the pot, we will be making suffrage sashes. So something you want to wear shopping, to church. Yeah, always popular. Tonight's speaker is from San Rafael, California. I think you get the award for coming the furthest distance. John Hart is the author of 16 books. Born in California, he explored Eastern roots while at Princeton, but left the beckoning academic track to become a freelance writer. And obviously it worked out for you. His topics include Western water controversies, farmland preservation, and wilderness travel. Tonight his topic is the same as the title of his book, Bluecoat and Pioneer, the Recollections of John Benton Hart, 1864 to 1868, and there will be a book signing following his talk. So the author has a very close connection to the story because John Benton Hart was your great-grandfather. And beginning in 1918, Senior Hart was coaxed into telling the stories about his life to his son Harry, who was an aspiring writer. And he recalled his adventures in the Civil War with the 11th Kansas Cavalry, and later working for the U.S. Army on the Bozeman Trail in the middle of the Indian resistance campaign known as Red Cloud's War. The author, with us tonight, and historian, places these memoirs in a historical context. And we're very pleased to have you here tonight, so please join me in welcoming John Hart.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that generous introduction. I might add that I am also a happy member of the Society and subscriber to Kansas history, which I wouldn't miss. Although the university system seems to think that I am probably a loyal alumnus who can be called upon at annual giving time without fail. Coming to this region for me is kind of a return to roots in two ways. A familial way, because this great-grandfather of mine was born in what was then Grasshopper Falls, now Valley Falls, Kansas. And although he wound up in Colorado, the previous generation is buried up near Valley Falls. And it's a return to roots for this particular book project because it was 6 years ago that I decided at long last it was time to do something with a rather fascinating memoir that had come down in my father's family, which begins with a description of the Battle of Westport and the events leading up to the Battle of Westport in 1864. And I thought that if people were going to be interested in this material, the 150th anniversary period of the events would be the time to get cracking. So I first came to Kansas and Missouri on this track in 2013, took up contact with people who knew about such things, and was quickly led to get in touch with Virgil Dean of Kansas History. And the result of this was initially a pair of articles for Kansas History extracting from these memoirs. One of them focused on the Battle of Westport, and a second one on the Battle of Platte Bridge against Indians in what's now Wyoming, a little less than a year later. And these articles, I think, played an important role in giving me the credentials to pitch a book project to University of Oklahoma Press, and the result is Bluecoat and Pioneer. So in a way, this is where it all began. I'll begin with a couple of slides tracking the generations back to our narrator. On your left in this photograph is a younger and much hairier version of myself. Standing up is my father, Lawrence Hart, who was an intellectual and noted teacher of creative writing in California. And I learned at his knee a great deal for a great many years. Hello. Oh, maybe it needed another.
Yep, there you go.
There we go.
Hopefully.
I love high tech.
Well, shoot, it worked before. There we go. No, there we go.
There we go. Okay. And his father was Harry Hart, and the tragedy was that Lawrence Hart did not know Harry Hart. The family had broken up when Lawrence was a child. But it was Harry Hart who extracted by main force these memoirs from his father, seen here in old age with his wife Corinna, John Benton Hart. He's photographed here in western Colorado, where he settled after his various earlier adventures. And here we have this same fellow much younger. On the right, as you see the photo, John Benton Hart with his fraternal twin brother Hugh, who also figures very largely in the memoirs. As you can see from the body language, although they were the same age, John Hart felt very protective of Hugh, whom he regarded as his intellectual superior, but not so strong physically as John. And here they are, shortly after having joined the 11th Kansas Cavalry, and not long before that body of men was called upon to resist General Sterling Price's invasion of Missouri a little over 150 years ago. Here's John Benton Hart's sign-up sheet from Grasshopper Falls, with a whole bunch from Grasshopper Falls and thereabouts. It's interesting to think that in those days, whole villages or families would sign up together with the risk that a whole village or family could be substantially wiped out in one bloody battle. Now, I think that people hereabouts will be more familiar with the Sterling Price invasion than people out in California, say, are. But it was mounted in September and October of 1864 in an attempt to rattle the Union, which was steaming toward its final victory, with the thought of possibly crossing the river and invading Illinois, and also with the thought that if they won some signal victories, they might influence the upcoming November 1864 election and cause a peace candidate to prevail over Abraham Lincoln. None of that happened. The raid was kind of a spectacular, bloody, very expensive and complicated dud. Sterling Price didn't manage to take any of his major objectives, but he stirred up a great deal of fear, mobilized tens of thousands of men on both sides, was finally conclusively defeated at what was then Westport, now the southern end of Kansas City, and retreated on the left side of your screen back to Arkansas. When word came that Price's forces were approaching Kansas, a force was organized and an existing force moved to the border, and the 11th Kansas Cavalry, which had been created just a few years earlier, was sent deep into Missouri to encounter the Price forces because nobody quite knew where they were as they approached Kansas City, to delay them in a series of small battles as long as possible, though the 11th Kansas was badly outnumbered. That wasn't the only unit involved. I'll simplify a little bit. Just generally to get in their way and slow them down until a larger Union force under General Pleasanton and another commander moved up from the east. They succeeded in stalling Price in front of Westport to the point where that second Union Army broke through, and it was all over for Price. There's Mr. Price, looking very, very handsome. He had been a governor of Missouri. He was a prominent fellow who was initially not in favor of secession, but he was a slaveholder himself, and as the Civil War really got going, he declared for the South. Apparently, at the time of this raid, he had become absolutely enormous, which doesn't really show in this picture, and really was not capable of riding or walking much anymore. leading a vast cavalry invasion. This is General Blunt, who was in overall command of the forces sent into Kansas to get in Price's way. And this is a Colonel Thomas Moonlight, a Welshman, whom we're going to hear a good deal about in the next few minutes, who was Johnny's immediate commander and whom he absolutely adored. He thought he was the finest officer ever put on earth. Moonlight later came to grief out on the frontier. Apparently he was good at fighting Confederates, but not good at fighting Indians because he couldn't take them seriously enough. He was too contemptuous to be a good warrior. And this is the head of Johnny's own company I, a Captain Drew, or Lieutenant Drew, whom he also speaks of very highly. He remarks that in those days, in Civil War days, there was often kind of an easy camaraderie between officers and men that is a little difficult to imagine in a later army. Okay, I'm going to read a bit before plunging into the details of a map which nobody can see anyway. And I'll describe what's going on, basically. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and read some words written by my father, Lawrence Hart, describing how this manuscript arrived on his doorstep. One day in the autumn of 1946, there arrived at my door in Berkeley, California, a massive carton sent to me COD by relatives in Colorado. In the carton were the papers of my father, Harry Hart. But the papers were more than personal, for they contained, with much else, the remarkable story of my grandfather, John Benton Hart, a Civil War cavalryman, frontiersman, and pioneer. I did not remember my father or my grandfather, and a family schism almost caused me to turn the shipment down. My wife and I did not know it then, but in taking the shipment, we had just averted what might have been the final loss of a historical resource. We began to read, each taking a sheaf from the top of the great mass. There were unskillful novels by my father, Harry Hart. There was poetry, mostly bad but good in spots. There was a great deal of original music. There was an interesting family tree full of melodramatic incidents. And there was the discovery of an unrecognized frontier character who happened to be my grandfather, John Benton Hart. For months we gave our time, all we could spare of it, to reading the manuscripts, amusement, delight, and discovery. There were errors and malapropisms. The captain of the wagon train was a gentleman from the word go. The Indian brave had a breech clout over his lions. But there were other passages, descriptive or emotional, that were simply brilliant. There were original accounts of little documented historical incidents. There were mysteries, too, resulting largely from gaps in the manuscript. And he goes on to describe how he and my mother, Jean McGahey Hart, went back to Colorado, reconnected with relatives they had not known, discovered that great portions of the manuscript had in fact been thrown away because they were messy and longhand and not very presentable. And that and when Harry died, nobody quite knew what to do with this massive material. But they did know that my dad was a literary kind of guy, so off went the box to Berkeley. Thank goodness. But back to the Missouri scene. Johnny's company arrives in Lexington, Missouri up on the river, and immediately becomes preoccupied with looking for food. And this is an interesting thing in these ground level Civil War accounts. The search for provisions is just a constant theme, especially for cavalry units that move fast and outrun their supplies. So they may be worried about fighting the rebels, or Johnnies as they called them, but first they're worried about finding hay, finding corn, finding something to eat for themselves and their horses. So here they are on the outskirts of Lexington. Our company lined up in the middle afternoon about 1/2 mile south of the fairground and 10 miles south of Lexington, and 2 miles south of Lexington. We were dismounted and lined up facing toward Price's men across a sweet potato field. Some of the potatoes were dug and heaped up in hills. There was corn, some of it in shocks and some still uncut, an ideal place for a hungry horse and soldier. Was eyeing one of those sweet potato piles about 20 feet in front of me and longed for just one of them. And like a flash, left the ranks heading for one of them. Just as I picked up one nice big fat fellow, an officer ordered me back. And it seemed like every one of the boys in that line had something to say about that sweet potato. What are you going to do with that potato? Give me a bite. Going to send it home to Ma? And last, a little bit of a dried up fellow asked, "Let me carry it for you for a while, Johnny?" I wanted to knock that dried up lad a rap, but dared not. So the fighting starts, and in some passages I won't read, but which are actually quite dramatic, a small subset of this expeditionary force battles Price's advancing men deep into the night and winds up on the shores of the Little Blue River just east of Independence, Missouri. And there's a bit of a pause in the action there. And Johnny's company is sent to the northernmost of several fords that the Union is trying to hold against the Confederates. And that's up at the top of this map at number 3, where he's located and where this action takes place. After a while, it began to be light, and then we could build fires. And then out from my saddle pocket, I pulled my old sweet potato and placed it in a bed of hot coals to bake. All the fellows around there crowded around my fire, asking dozens of questions and giving advice about my potato. One little fellow wanted me to save him an eye. Another one wanted to hold it for me on a board while I ate it. And still another said that sweet potatoes was dangerous to have inside of one because his old aunt got blowed up eating one time. Had just about got my sweet potato good and hot when a picket fired a shot, and right on the heels of that shot came the order to fall in. Quick as I could, and that wasn't long, raked my potato out of the coals and shoved it into my saddle pocket, and away we went. You see, our boys had had a couple of hours of pretty good rest, and it seemed a little uncanny somehow, everything for a time being so still and quiet there. Up on a little ridge we went, and then hailed some soldiers down on the timber. They said they were Yankees. Soon, however, they proved to be Johnnies, for they came for us. Across a field we hit it up, but we're losing ground, so Lieutenant Drew ordered us to make for a house up on the hill, where there could be seen a big gate and a girl standing outside by the house. And tentatively, that house can be identified as one belonging to Lawson Moore, which you see along the route leading westward from that first star. There are many historical puzzles raised by any source like this, and one of them is that there really shouldn't have been anybody living in that house at that time. because the rural dwellers of these counties had been evacuated in an attempt to tamp down guerrilla warfare. So had people moved back in? What's the story? Don't know. Lieutenant Drew hollowed to the girl to please open the gate and let us go through. Quick, she ran like a deer and opened the gate for us and held it open until we all got through and held that gate, mind you, under fire, while dozens of bullets were whizzing by. Every one of us boys thanked that girl. As we went through the opened way on a dead run, some of them said, "God bless you." Then we were through. The girl shut the gate and ran into the house. Away we went into a cornfield, like a bunch of Indians scared half to death. For behind was 5-1 against us, all eager to take us prisoners. The corn in the field was high, and the horses made a swath through this, 40 feet wide. We got away all right, but it was a good run. Up on a little ridge a quarter of a mile away, Lieutenant Drew looked back toward the house where the girl had opened the gate for us, and could see the Johnnies were going back below the house, and some of them were firing into it. Lieutenant Drew shook his fist at them, saying, "You fellows hurt a hair on that girl's head, and I will come back and blow your crowd into hell." So while these guys were running for their lives, a major battle was taking shape to the south of them. There had been an argument among the commanders as to where was the best place to make a definitive stand against Price's invasion. And Moonlight and Blugh thought it should be right here on the Little Blue River, that the terrain was very favorable. But their overall chief, General Curtis, declined to do that because the Kansas militia, who were an important backup force, wouldn't go that deep into Missouri. So, and nonetheless, there was quite a successful delaying action fought by the Union forces called the Battle of the Little Blue. Johnny missed it because he was busy running across country being chased by various groups of Price's cavalry. For a long time, our little bunch of men rode after that until finally Lieutenant Drew said, "We must be about far enough back. The artillery firing sounds away back in the rear of us now." So all hands rode to the top of a little ridge and looked over. Much to our surprise, there below in the road was cavalry marching four abreast as far as we could see up and down the road. Lieutenant Drew asked them who they were. They replied, "We are Marmaduke's men," Marmaduke being one of the Confederate commanders, and laughed. And then again, "Jim Lane's Tads" rolled up to us from a dozen throats. Now this is ironic because James Lane was actually on the Union side and was a famous jayhawker before he became a regular soldier. That is, he was a pro-Union guerrilla as opposed to the pro-Southern guerrillas, the bushwhackers. So these Southerners saying they are Jim Lane's Tads were really pulling the leg kind of the Northern soldiers. Their captain ordered fire without any preliminaries whatsoever, which they did in quick too, and then a big bunch of their men came on a run for us. There was nothing to do but run for it, back over the way we came. But hold, whoa, stop, before we knew it, we were right in front of another column of cavalry marching four abreast, coming toward us, some 300 yards away. This rattled all of our little band. Down to a house along a little creek we rode and jumped our horses over a fallen tree close by the side of a house, when there was a better way around the house, but we didn't know it. Then the people in the house commenced firing at us, which made our position still worse. So into a cornfield we went. couldn't find no hole to crawl into. Had to do something. At the edge of this cornfield was a swamp, and that swamp didn't look a bit inviting to our men. "Into it," Lieutenant Drew shouted. "We can't be taken prisoners here." And into it we went, and by good fortune made the other side easier than expected. As we gained the bank and solid footing even more, there in front of us was a steep hill that had to be made on the double quick, which tried our horses and worried us. Here, Jim Lane's Tads, who had by this time gained considerable distance on us, began to shower a perfect rain of bullets over our heads. Everyone after that went for himself up that hill, getting behind big trees, something in the fashion a wild turkey will do in the wild woods to evade a man with a gun. Our horses were all fresh mounts and were able to hold their own, while our enemy's horses were pretty good too, but they couldn't go into the wind quite so keen as ours. And that is the only reason our outfit got out of the jaws of 2 columns of steel and muscle and up on the hillside to the comparative refuge of the timber. But nearly halfway up the hill, my bunkie Tom Roderick, the second of mine to be killed, got shot in the back and fell off his horse. Lieutenant Drew examined him in a hurry, and Tom was begging us not to leave him. So I started back to him. "Go on," Lieutenant Drew ordered. "You can't help him now, his back is broke." "Well," I said, "I don't want to leave him here. That's pretty rough." "It is, Johnny, but some more of us will get it if we don't get out of here." Up on the top of the hill, just before we went scurrying away, one more look we must have down through the trees to where our comrade lay, and something hard for our eyes there to stand we saw. The Johnnies were shooting Tom Roderick to death, finishing him then and there, but that even was some consolation in that it put him out of his misery. Now, unfortunately for the writer of footnotes, if there was someone killed in this manner, his name wasn't Tom Roderick, because Tom Roderick turns up later on the frontier in one piece. But I assume that someone met this fate, and that Johnny mixed up his names. I have to do a little bit of Colonel Moonlight here. After a street fight in Independence, Missouri, on the right margin of your screen, Johnny's company winds up camped at a place called Simmons Ford, and there has been a snafu. They are not really supposed to be there. They're supposed to be a few miles south at another ford, which as a consequence is left unguarded. And this is where Price's forces are going to break through and cross the Big Blue River, which is the next line of defense. Johnny knows nothing about all this. There were feints by the Confederates at various points along this defensive line, and one of them was apparently at Simmons Ford, and there's an officer on a white horse, a Confederate officer, that is riding back and forth in the water and kind of taunting the Union guys, and they lose control and charge, trying to kill or capture this Confederate officer. And it's so unexpected by everyone that the charge is actually quite successful, and they get some prisoners and blunt that Confederate advance. But Colonel Moonlight is not happy. Colonel Moonlight raged and swore and rested for breath and then started in on us again. "Boys," he said, "we are fighting this campaign for a principle, for what we think is right. Don't ever charge again without orders from an officer. Be honorable, be dependable. Your charge was successful because unexpected on all sides, but if it hadn't have been, we would be in a fine position now. You have stood firm against shot and shell before. Why weaken now? I bow my head in shame before boys I trusted and considered equal to anything under the sun. Then Colonel Moonlight rode on down the line saying something about how foolish some people are, even after they have been trained. So at least because in part of this communications mix-up at the ford, Price's forces crossed the Big Blue River, or just Blue River as it's now more commonly called, really whipped the Yankees back to the Kansas border and north toward Westport. Then the battle ebbs and flows for the rest of that particular day, and it's a rough day for the Union. The following day, the Battle of Westport proper, we're now at Sunday, October. Oh, that's the contemporaneous sketch of the Battle of the Big Blue by a fellow who was taken prisoner and spent time in southern prisoner of war camps. And here are a bunch more arrows running various directions. But the essence of the thing is that the Confederates are dug in on the west bank of the Blue River. The Yankees are pushing down from the north and are already doing pretty well when the Union forces that have been pursuing Price from the east finally catch up with him and force their way through, in turn crossing the Blue River just as Price had a day earlier. And the combination of those two is a hammer and anvil sort of thing, and the Price army begins to fall apart and starts its retreat toward Arkansas. Johnny's unit was pulled back to the Kansas line to guard against Price making it into Kansas, and wasn't in the middle of this action, but they were able to observe it quite well. And Johnny leaves an account of the moment when the two Union forces are able to link up and Price's tide is turned against him. Our company and several others were on a hill where we could see a way down on the Blue. We were lined up and counting off. Something was going to happen pretty soon. We had been everywhere this Sunday and saw things changing before our eyes, whipped by the Johnnies in the morning, and in turn they were whipped by us in a showdown and were on the retreat. We could see at the bottom of the hill where Johnnies were lining up and counting off about 3 regiments of cavalry. About the time they were lined up, here through the timber of the Blue came Pleasanton's cavalry, the Union, about 3 regiments. They came out below us and formed as they came. We knew there was going to be something doing pretty soon. These 3,000 cavalry of Pleasantons going to match their strength with an equal number of Johnnies. We shouted at the top of our voices. We stood up in our stirrups as if to make our noise carry further. Colonel Moonlight ordered all of the line officers and sergeants in front to keep us from charging. He wanted to make sure we obeyed orders. I'll give you the charge in time if Pleasanton's men cannot handle their end of the line. You wild-eyed daredevil bunch, hold still. I'll say when, Colonel Moonlight shouted. We loved Colonel Moonlight. We worshipped him. It was heavenly to have him lecture us in his plain, honest way. He had very little self-esteem, but a wonderful amount of good common sense right over his eyes. balancing the front side of his head straight on ahead through calms and through storms. This is not the historian's general impression of Moonlight, but his men really seem to have loved him. We knew Pleasanton's men drew their sabers because of the sun's reflection on their steel. We could hear the bugle sound the charge. We could see that line of cavalry advance forward. Then in a little while, the bugle sounded the double quick, and then the whole line of men lunged. They intended to do something that evening, and that line of Price cavalry would have to fight. We cheered, we were excited, we wanted to be in on that charge. And all the time that line of Johnnies stood there. They never showed the white feather. They were as good as our boys, and why not? Closer and closer Pleasanton's cavalry advanced. Now they were within about 100 yards of the Johnnies, all on the double quick and earnest. And then we could see a soldier here and there along the line speed up and leave his comrades. Daredevils they were, going to meet their death ahead of their time. Since our line was up close to the Johnnies and the Johnnies still stood there, it was steel against steel, muscle against muscle, sand against sand, fate against fate. We stood up in our stirrups and well nigh forgot to breathe. Then that whole line of Johnnies fired, 3,000 bullets, good for 3,000 Union horses, or 3,000 Union men, provided they all hit the mark. But it is hard to fire true in the face of an onrush of men and horses. It is hard to keep down the quiver and tension of muscles. The eye is apt to overrate the distance and fool you on the bead, and a rapid heart beating under excitement does not make for accurate shooting. And that is why our boys were not swayed in the advance of their charge. The line did reel and sway, and horses and men were down. We could see men leave their wounded horses and continue the charge on foot, unswayed, undaunted, and unwhipped. Why shouldn't we cheer? Skipping a little bit. Round and round, up and at it, across and over and down, then all over again, continuous, everlasting, and death. Then could see breaking, running, hurrying, and scurrying. The Johnnies were going, they were whipped. The Yankees did not follow them. They were too near used up and had all about all they wanted before the sun went down. It was worth living a lifetime to see that charge of the blue and the gray. Now I suppose that the courage of these soldiers on both sides may be a little bit exaggerated in memory, but it is interesting to see how to see this report of the warrior spirit really forgetting the considerable odds of being killed or maimed, and maimed often meant killed in those days. And I suppose it's what armies are always trying to generate in their troops, this feeling that your loyalty to your unit is more important than anything, and that your life is in some way expendable even if you don't really think it's going to be you. That it's just an interesting and kind of pleasingly old-fashioned take on soldierly courage. So there's a long description of the sad for the Confederates, but still fiercely fought retreat of Price and his very long baggage train full of loot he had picked up along the way toward Arkansas. And for the men of the 11th, it wasn't that much different from the time they had been in the depths of Missouri trying to slow Price down. They were still frequently riding at night, having brief stops, and getting ahead of their provisions. And during this later phase of the campaign, Johnny keeps trying to cook that sweet potato. This comical thread of the sweet potato keeps weaving in and out of the story, which makes it fun. The fire for my mess was going pretty good, so out comes my sweet potato once more. It had been baked a little in the fires before and had a few bites gnawed off around the side by my humble teeth. Otherwise, this potato of mine nearly had its original shape. Into the coals it went once more, and I just had to sit there on a log and stand guard over that potato of mine. It hadn't been baking very long, just enough to nearly get it hot through when that dreaded fall in came clanging down the line. Everything round about sprang into life and motion. I kicked my potato out of the coals, grabbed it up in my hands and brushed it off a little, then jammed it down into my saddle pocket. But the wrong one, being that careless and in such a hurry. This saddle pocket the potato got into was the one I had been carrying cartridges in, and some of them had gotten loose in some way and let the powder and the shells fall out. The saddle pocket seemed to be empty when the hot potato was crowded down into the bottom of it. Immediately old Pones, my horse, jumped and ran away from me as the powder in that saddle pocket hissed and sputtered flame. He mixed everybody and everything all up and made quite a commotion. Couldn't catch him, for some of the powder was wet and some dry, and every time I approached near to him, off some more powder would go. Then away Pones went, kicking and bucking like a bronco. Lieutenant Clancy came running up, demanding what was the matter. When told, he was angry. "Johnny," he called, "you are a hoodoo for the whole company. Always you have to be doing something. When will this combination of you and the horse and the potato cease to be? Boys, get the horse. Kill it if you can't get it no other way. Put him on his horse and trust to good luck. There is no telling what he'll do next in the midst of this inferno of hell. Don't let him cook his potato on the back of that horse." And the lieutenant went away down the line, but he was smiling. And this seems to be a recurrent theme in this memoir, because this kid, and he really is a kid in the period we're describing, is always in trouble. He has very poor impulse control. He gets an idea and he executes it. He almost touches off warfare between the white troops and the American troops and the Indian, an allied Indian tribe on the frontier by playing pranks on the allied Crow Indians. He's dangerous, but he always somehow talks his way out of it. So a day or so later, we get the end of this story. Then once more dug out my sweet potato, now worn and dusty and flavored with a very nice powder smell. Then I split it into two halves and chucked them both in the hot ashes and coals, but that was not all. An extra precaution and vigilance had to be kept up even while I slept. So a heavy stick was laid over the coals where my potato was roasting, and on that stick my feet were placed to stand guard while my head slept a refreshing slumber. Some part of me had to stand guard, or some other man would eat my sweet potato and not I. In half an hour I awoke and found my potato roasted fine on one side. That was good enough, that near baked. So I stuck a slice of bacon on a stick, held it over the hot coals, and soon had the grease dropping over my 1/2 slice of potato. Then went to eating and bragging how fine my sweet potato was and smacking my lips to make the other fellows wish they had some too. I knew that bunch would make me divide if my sweet potato looked too large, but leaving 1/2 of it in the coals saved me from trouble. But when I brought out the other and larger half and another slice of bacon, the boys began to be a little nervous. I suppose they thought my potato was swelling and toasting faster than I could eat it. One fellow said, "If someone would dare me, I will take that potato away from Johnny. He must have a wagon load of them there under the coals." Lieutenant Clancy could stand it no longer, so he found a stick and a slice of bacon, which he warmed over the coals, then sat down beside me and commenced dripping grease on the other end of my potato, thus really appropriating that end. We together finished it in short order. Lieutenant Clancy thought it was very fine, think it was all he could do to eat it, with all of the powder that was on the outside of it. "Now, Johnny," the lieutenant said, "that is the last of the sweet potato that has caused you trouble and the rest of us as well. You ought to be in the guardhouse for not having a better supply." So we're kind of coming up on the hour mark, but I guess I'll move us out west for just a couple of minutes. Not long after the end of the Price invasion or raid, there occurred out on the frontier something called the Sand Creek Massacre, in which an assembly, a village of Indians who had agreed to not to oppose the government and had accepted federal protection were more or less wiped out by a sadistic federal officer, John Chivington. And this had a crystallizing effect on a number of tribes up and down the frontier who had been resisting the United States expansion and settlement and progressive invasion bit by bit here and there. But the Sand Creek Massacre caused several of the tribes to enter into an alliance in a way they really had not done before. And in the summer of 1865, they mounted a concerted campaign aimed at severing the Oregon Trail, going through Wyoming and on toward Oregon and California. The federal authorities saw what was about to happen in late 1864 and hustled the 11th Kansas across the plains. Apparently it was a brutal journey. They were under-equipped for those conditions. Johnny says nothing about it. They wound up stationed and roving up and down out of a spot at present-day Casper, Wyoming, called Platte Bridge Station on the Oregon Trail and Telegraph Line. And there they took place a rather celebrated event in August of '65 called the Battle of Platte Bridge, in which a Lieutenant Casper Collins was killed, after whom Casper, Wyoming would later be named. There are a lot of complexities to this story and to Johnny's version of this story, which provides new evidence here and there, but also shows some confusion about some of the basic facts and order of events and so forth. Among the things that he tells in this connection is that in the heat of one battle he scalped an Indian, a Cheyenne chief, and was deeply ashamed of himself. And when I tried to authenticate this, I found that there were half a dozen other people who claimed to have done this deed. But interestingly, Johnny is the only one who was ashamed of himself. So I have no idea who really did it. But is it something you would make up and tell on yourself? I don't know. If you didn't think it was a good idea in your heart of hearts. Anyway, As the story progresses, an enormous mass of Indians has gathered north of the Platte River at Platte Bridge Station, the North Platte River at Platte Bridge Station. And you can see, I guess, a fairly realistic portrayal of the number of Indians gathered for ambush. There were thousands of them, of several tribes. And they were menacing a wagon train that was coming in from the west. And a detachment was sent out to go to the relief of that wagon train and marched right into this enormous ambush. And this detachment was, oddly enough, commanded by this Lieutenant Casper Collins, although he was not an officer of the 11th Cavalry. He just happened to be at Platte Bridge Station at that moment. And just how this came about is a subject of considerable historical debate. At any rate, the guys are getting ready to ride across the bridge. Soon we were ready, but Lieutenant Collins was determined to ride a very large gray horse that belonged to our company. He was a splendid horse, but would whirl around in the ranks, breaking the line. The rider could pull his bits against his neck, it made no difference. If the notion struck this horse at any time, away he would go where he pleased, providing he became the least bit excited. We warned the lieutenant about the fault of this horse, but our efforts availed us nothing. Now, all accounts of this battle, and there are just 3 or 4 others, mention this horse, but how Casper Collins got this horse and why is unclear. And Johnny is the only one to suggest that Casper Collins picked this particular horse out of vanity. I have no idea what's true. I was in the first set of 4s. Across the bridge we marched and out onto the mesa, following that teasing bunch of Indians back about 1/2 mile, where we halted as wished to ascertain the whereabouts of the yelling that sounded overhead, to the sides, and everywhere else. In a moment we saw we were in a trap, for 200 warriors had rushed in behind us, cutting our retreat back to the post out of the question, and another band of Indians came out of the river bottom above the post, and so were between us and the bridge. A few seconds after this, the Indians closed in on us and fired, but mostly with arrows, and then when an arrow missed a soldier, it hit an Indian. The Indians were so numerous around us, nothing could hit the ground, arrows or bullets, and the terrific din of yelling, commotion, Indians afoot, others mounted, and last the whirling of ponies and swirling of countless clouds of dust. The Indians were all stripped to the breechclout, their bodies and faces all painted in grotesque shapes and colors, a hideous-looking sight, and one that always rattles those not accustomed to it, be they ever so brave and steady. It wasn't long until the Indians discovered they were killing more of their own members than ours with arrows, so they quit and commenced to using spears. And this is confirmed by the other accounts, notably by that of George Bent, who was a mixed race frontier character who associated with both Indians and whites alternately. And in this battle, he was fighting for the Indians. The lieutenant's large gray mount bolted almost at the first, and the last I saw of him was the big gray going over those Indian ponies, as if they were so many feeble sheep. Soon discovered that to level my revolver at an Indian was about as good as to shoot him, for he would throw himself on the ground or on the side of his pony and dodge out of sight, and to get him I would have to be quick. This method gave me an opportunity to be ready for another Indian and saved my ammunition. I believe this is what saved me from being scalped that day. These Indians seemed to drive terror among some of our men so that they lost control of themselves and did not fight the good fight to the last. Very good. I know that George MacDonald yelled for me to help him, that he was lanced twice and fell off his horse, and at that with a loaded revolver in his scabbard. And MacDonald was as brave a man as ever wore a uniform, but he lost control. And Jim Porter met the same fate as MacDonald, good boy that he was. Both of these boys, many's the time, had stood up to the Johnnies without flinching and could be moved under the heaviest fire anywhere. Our little band was thinning out fast, and the Indians were pushing us harder every second. In a flash, we were thirsty, tired, and weary, fighting out 100 years of life in a few minutes. Skipping some gory detail. All at once I gave a yell as was riding off the mesa and into the bottomland 200 yards from the bridge. There were the boys at the fort coming out to help us. In a few seconds after this, I knew I was safe. So this was not the last of his Indian adventures. But before I just show a couple of final slides, I'll mention the fate of a man named Sebastian Nering, or Nering, I guess it would be in German, a Prussian who was part of of Company I of the 11th Kansas, who was killed in this sortie into ambush. And at least I think the person I'm about to mention must be Sebastian. The Indians scalped and terribly mutilated 18 of our boys. We had an old German soldier in our company who was killed when out as a volunteer. He was quite gray, a man of splendid nerve and respected by all. The Indians did not scalp or mutilate his body, but they did fill his body with arrows. I pulled 93 arrows out of his body 2 days afterwards when we hauled him into the post. Lieutenant Casper Collins was mutilated worse than any of the men. About 1/2 of his body was carried away. His heart was cut into strings and hung on a medicine pole beside what was left of his body. Now, another account about Sebastian Nering states that he was horribly mutilated, especially horribly mutilated. So who's right here? Johnny, who says he was only wounded horribly, but not molested beyond that. It's possible that Johnny is right because the Indians were known not to mutilate victims who had shown conspicuous bravery, and that might go with the character he ascribes to Mr. Nering, if it is Mr. Nering. That's a little bit of a leap. And there are a number of Nerings and descendants and relations not far from here to the west, I believe. So this particular battle happens down here. The 11th Kansas is mustered out, returns to Kansas in that fall. But a couple of years later, here comes Johnny again as a civilian headed for the goldfields of Montana by way of this new route called the Bozeman Trail, which had been opened a couple of years earlier to the intense hostility of particularly the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians. And there ensued a war of several years, which we call Red Cloud's War. It's kind of a prelude to the better known campaign culminating in the Little Big Horn battle. So he winds up, Johnny and also brother Hugh, at Fort C.F. Smith at the northern end of this map, and has all kinds of adventures, which I won't read from. He becomes a good friend of a number of Crow Indians, the Crow Indians being allied with the government against the Sioux and Cheyenne, and also takes an assignment carrying the mail between Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Phil Kearny down here, forts that had been constructed to protect travelers on this trail, and has some hair-raising adventures and also a number of trips that pass without incident, which he describes in some detail. And yet there is no trace in official or unofficial records, or very little trace, of any such mailman ever having existed. And I spent a long time trying to find something that proved he was really there and really did that. I'm inclined to believe him because of the circumstantiality and detail and realism of his descriptions. And there does seem to be a little bit of room for interpolating him into the record. But maybe someday somebody will find something that really proves the matter one way or another. Oh, that's Fort C.F. Smith, where he was based. This is the victor in Red Cloud's War, whom Johnny didn't meet. This is Jim Bridger, the famous scout and mountain man, whom Johnny did meet, and the book contains a kind of a wonderful tall story supposedly told by Jim Bridger around a campfire about how the famous scout and explorer got hopelessly lost in St. Louis. This is John Benton Hart a little later in life, fixing to be a Colorado state legislator. He wound up on the western slope of Colorado after having helped found the town of Canola, Kansas, which has now been rolled into modern Granola, Kansas. But Kansas couldn't hold him ultimately. He was a miner by heart, and he wound up in the high country of Colorado, and then moved to the western slope and irrigated a desert valley still known as Hart's Basin. There he is in legislative garb. And there he is again with Corinna as an older man in Hart's Basin. And there's Harry, who is almost the co-author of these memoirs, and certainly the one to whom we owe their survival and their recording. And I'm sorry I never met him, and I'm grateful to him. End of show. Glad to try to field any questions.
Questions?
John is a great-great-grandson of a member of Company K of the 11th. I salute you on your work and thank you for insight into their service in Kansas City and environs West. Picture is worth 1,000 words. I'm assuming the picture of John and Hugh in uniform was taken sometime during their service along the border.
Yes, I'm sure it was, but I don't know when.
And evident that they were adapting tactics of their Missouri brothers with the exposed butts of their pistols instead of regulation with the flap over the pistol.
Oh, that's interesting. In order for quick access, and also perhaps to be more of a threat, to send a signal. Or interesting. Certainly for the Kansas-Missouri borderlands, the Civil War was just the continuation of something that had been going on for quite a while. Great, thank you. And
You answered everyone's questions.
oh,
Or if they all want to get a book from you now. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
thank you, Mary.
Yeah, it was
It's a great pleasure.
Fascinating story. I think we just heard the tip of the iceberg from the book. And he will be signing. You will be signing books in the lobby. And the museum store is open. There's coffee and cookies, and we're not taking them home, so help yourself. And come back next month, November 8th, Crossing No Man's Land, the French, oh, no, the Trench. I can't read my own writing. Crossing No
I'm sure
Man's...
there were French there, too.
There were French.
Yeah.
Thank you. Crossing No Man's Land, the Trench Stalemate, and the Birth of Modern Warfare, 1915-1918, by our good friend Dr. Richard Faulkner, who's been here before and is with the Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. So we look forward to seeing you then. You too, Virgil. Okay, thanks for coming. Have a good evening. Stay warm.